Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, David Held. David is an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the Robotics Institute and the director of the Robots Perceiving and Doing Lab. David's research specializes in perceptual robot learning, developing methods at the intersection of robot perception and planning for interacting with novel, perceptually challenging and deformable objects. With a Ph.D. in computer science from Stanford and degrees from MIT, he is also a recipient of the Google Faculty Research Award and the NSF CAREER Award. Please join me in welcoming David Held.
Great, thank you everyone. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about some research on spatially aware robot learning applied to deformable object manipulation. So we all know a robot consists of a perception system and planning system. And one question is how to represent the state of the object. So for rigid objects, we can use the 6D pose of the object. But what do we do to represent the pose, rigid, non-rigid objects like this cloth? We need to figure out how to represent the object in a way that will enable robots to manipulate it to achieve a task. So we need to find some representation that we can infer from observations that is useful for planning and that is suitable for a task. Now, it's popular nowadays to use end-to-end black box representations. However, such representations often don't generalize well to unseen objects or unseen configurations. So I'm going to talk about today some different ways that we might represent a cloth for different tasks, and then we can try to think about what insights we can get to be able to represent cloth. I'm going to start by talking about some work that was published in RSS 2022 about mesh-based dynamics with occlusion reasoning for cloth manipulation. This work was led by my students Zixuan Wang and Xingyu Lin. So occlusion can make cloth manipulation very difficult. Here's an example where you have a shirt that looks like it's lying flat on the table, except if you understand how occlusions work, as most people do, you realize that actually it's not entirely flat. There's a part of the arm that is tucked underneath the rest of the shirt that the robot should try to untuck in order to properly flatten out and then fold or hang up the shirt. So we need to somehow enable robots to reason about occlusions to handle these types of challenges. Now, one possible way to do this is to train a neural network that takes as input an observation of the cloth and tries to predict the full 3D mesh of the cloth. And this has been explored in prior work. However, it's very challenging to do this due to the high deformability of the cloth, the high dimensionality of the cloth. It has many degrees of freedom. And there's also a lot of ambiguity because you only see the visible part of the cloth, so you don't really know what's lying underneath. Now, another approach that people sometimes take is to pick up the cloth, and this allows you to more easily reconstruct the cloth while it's in the air. And once you have captured the full mesh of the cloth in the air, you can then use that to flatten and fold the cloth. However, these approaches often, or at least sometimes, have a limitation, which is that if you can only estimate the state of the cloth accurately while it's in the air, then the rest of the manipulation is more or less open loop, meaning if the cloth happens to enter into an unexpected state while it's on the table, you might not be able to estimate the state and recover. So our goal is to figure out how to reconstruct the state of a crumpled cloth from arbitrarily crumpled configurations, which is challenging even for the best trained neural network. So our insight is, instead of relying on a neural network to try to output the perfect prediction directly, we're going to use self-supervised test time fine-tuning in order to refine the network's prediction. So how can we perform self-supervised test time fine-tuning? Our first observation is that we can use the unidirectional chamfer distance. So our observation of the cloth is a partial observation of the visible points in the cloth. So it's not going to correspond directly to our prediction, which is supposed to be the full 3D mesh of the cloth. But for every visible point on the observation, that point should correspond to some point in the cloth mesh. So we have a loss that we're going to use at test time, which is that every point in the cloth should have a minimal in the observation should have a minimal distance at some point in the full 3D cloth mesh. We also use something we call a mapping consistency loss. So for this, I'll mention here that we're building on top of a paper called Garment Nets, which is a really excellent paper from Sharon Song's group, in which they take a partial observation of the cloth, map that into a canonical space. Then they run shape completion in this canonical space to estimate the full 3D mesh in the canonical orientation. And then they map from the canonical mesh back into the observation space. Now, we build on Garment Nets as well. And one thing we know is that if you take one of the visible points in the observation and you track that point as it gets mapped to the canonical space and then back to the observation, it should hopefully get mapped back to the same exact place where that point started. In reality, that doesn't always happen perfectly due to errors in each of these steps. So we can then add another loss, which is this consistency loss that this point should map back to where it started. And these are both losses that we can apply at test time because they don't require any additional ground truth information. They're kind of just things that should be true about all cloths if we have properly reconstructed the 3D mesh. So, okay, so yeah, so our general pipeline is going to be to first run Garment Nets to get an initial estimate of the full 3D cloth mesh, and then we will run our self-supervised tests and fine-tuning losses to refine the mesh and improve it. And here you can see the results. So here is an RGB visualization of the observation of the cloth. We only use depth though in our method. Here is the output of Garment Nets, which you can see roughly gets the shape of the cloth, but misses many of the fine-grained details. And then we run our self-supervised losses to refine this mesh at test time. And now you can see that the mesh is deforming and much better matches the shape of the ground truth mesh. Here you can see some more examples where the left column shows the ground truth mesh and the right column is showing iterative optimization procedure where the initial predicted mesh is getting refined over time until it matches ideally as well as possible to the ground truth mesh on the left. So previously that was showing trousers. This is a dress. Here's a crumpled skirt. And then here is a jumpsuit. So there's still some errors that remain, but I guess the main takeaway is that it's much closer to the actual shape of the cloth compared to the initial prediction. Okay, so we evaluate this approach on two tasks. So first is cloth flattening, meaning what we're going to do is after we estimate the full 3D shape of the cloth, we're going to input that predicted shape into a mesh dynamics model and then run model-based reinforcement learning to search over actions and find the actions that achieve some task. The first task being to flatten a crumpled cloth. So the goal is to maximize the total covered area of the cloth. And that's a pretty good objective when you just have a towel that you want to flatten, but it actually doesn't give the desired result when you have an object like a shirt. Here's a shirt that's spread out to cover maximum area, but it's not in the sort of canonical shape that's useful for folding. So we have another task, which is to canonicalize the cloth shape. Or transform the clothes into some canonical pose. And we, again, for each of these, we take our mesh prediction and then run that through a learned dynamics model and optimize over actions. So this diagram kind of visualizes that our initial prediction, fine-tuned prediction with self-supervised losses, and then use the dynamics model to plan over actions. And here you can see the performance. So this is using, so the y-axis is the normalized improvement, so higher is better. Here showing two model-based approaches that don't do any occlusion reasoning. So visual foresight plans over predicted pixel images of the cloth. VCD, visible connectivity dynamics, is our lab's previous work that plans over the visible part of the cloth. Then here is the original Garmin nets. If you take that prediction and try to plan using that predicted model. Here is a modified version of Garmin nets that has a couple of modifications that we found to give a large improvement, which is to use a network called HRNet instead of PointNet++. HRNet is a 2D CNN that takes as input a depth map and predicts very fine-grained features for all the details in the cloth and leads to big improvement in performance. And we also predict coordinates in relative terms instead of absolute coordinates. So that leads to a big improvement. And then adding the self-supervised test and fine-tuning leads to a further improvement in performance. So we did some analysis to say, okay, why do those last two methods that we mentioned that do occlusion reasoning, or last three methods that do occlusion reasoning, why do they actually help? So there's two theories that you can form about why occlusion reasoning might help for cloth manipulation. The first theory you might come up with is that the reconstructed cloth might help with estimating rewards. So if you're computing rewards for planning based on the partial observation of the cloth, then your rewards will be noisy compared to rewards using the full ground truth completed cloth. And the second idea is that if you have the full completed cloth mesh, then your dynamics model will be more accurate because your dynamics model can reason over the dynamics of the entire cloth, not just the dynamics of the partial observation. So these are two theories, and we can disambiguate those theories with a careful experiment. So what we do is we have our full method on the right. Again, this is normalized improvement, so higher is better. And on the left, we have the method that has no occlusion reasoning. And in the middle, we have a hybrid method that uses the predicted mesh for the dynamics, but uses the it uses it uses the partial observation to obtain the reward. So to review, on the left, no occlusion reasoning uses only the visible part of the mesh for both the dynamics and the reward. The middle one uses the full mesh to obtain the dynamics, but the visible part of the mesh to obtain the reward. And ours uses the full mesh, the full predicted mesh for both the dynamics and the reward. So what you can see here is that there's a benefit to both, but the biggest jump comes from going from the second to the third, meaning that the real benefit of occlusion reasoning, at least according to this experiment, is that you get more accurate rewards. And so that's really interesting insight. Maybe we can think about different ways that we can obtain rewards from partial observations. But that's where occlusion reasoning is most helpful. Okay, so let's look at some videos. So here is a crumble cloth, and we're going to use this method I described to flatten the cloth. And so again, we're predicting a mesh and then searching over actions to flatten it. And you can see that even though it starts in a pretty crumpled state, we're able to figure out how to take actions to put the cloth into the canonical configuration. So, so this is a pair of pants. It's going to do a few sort of final touches to get it into as close as possible into what it considers to be the canonical configuration of pants. And then here's finally the last example. Great. All right. So another analysis that we can do is we can say, well, this is pretty good, but it's not perfect. Where are the remaining gaps in performance? And so we can do an analysis to understand that as well. So here's our full method, but we could try replacing the predicted mesh with the ground truth mesh. But remember that we're also using a learned dynamics model. So we can see how well that combination works of using the ground truth mesh with the learned dynamics model. Learned dynamics models tend to actually work better on predicted meshes compared to ground truth dynamics models because of the errors in the predicted mesh. But if you have the ground truth mesh, then you would typically prefer to use ground truth dynamics if you had the choice. So here you can see the boost in performance when you replace a predicted mesh with the ground truth mesh, but still use a learned dynamics model. And on the right, you can see if you use the ground truth mesh and ground truth dynamics. The remaining error here is because of the search procedure, which is not always going to find the optimal actions because it's sampling actions and then picking the best sampled one. So there's actually an improvement from both of these components. I wouldn't say one is necessarily larger than the other. And so it seems like both mesh prediction needs to be improved, as well as mesh dynamics, learning cloth dynamics also needs to be improved. And these are simulated experiments, so it also doesn't cover further gaps that come from sim material transfer. Okay, great. So to summarize this project, we estimate the full structure of the cloth from crumpled configurations. We use test time self-supervised fine-tuning to improve the network's predictions, and we use our method for cloth manipulation to perform with occlusion reasoning to give better manipulation performance. Okay, so next I'm going to discuss a follow-up project that we did by the same authors, Ishuan Xing Yu. It was published in ICRA 2023 that performs action condition cloth tracking to improve the cloth reconstruction. So the basic motivation here is that, as we just saw, learning the mesh reconstruction is difficult due to many factors, one of which is that we don't actually have a lot of real-world mesh data to train on. We can train in simulation and try to transfer to the real world, but there's going to be a sim to real gap. And so how can we close that gap? Well, one way to close it is if we can somehow fine-tune our model on real-world data, then we can try to close the gap. But how do we get ground truth for the real world? One way to do it is to try to estimate the mesh in the real world and use that as a sort of pseudo ground truth. Now, if you only had a single image in the real world, this would be challenging, but we can take advantage of the fact that we often have a video in the real world. And specifically, we can create these videos where the cloth starts in a very simple initial state and then becomes more and more crumpled over time. And if we can somehow track the cloth over time, then we can use that to obtain ground truth to train our mesh prediction model. And so we have this sequence, and the other thing that we have in the real world is the actions that took us from one image in the sequence to the next one. So at a high level, what we're going to do is collect unlabeled real-world data. We'll start with a pre-trained mesh reconstruction model from the previous project that I described. We will use that along with a dynamics model to create an action condition cloth tracker that will create a pseudo ground truth mesh. And then we will take these predicted meshes and use that to fine-tune the model. And this can kind of form a nice loop here. The way that we collect the data in the real world is we're going to manipulate the cloth using these tweezers They're long, so the person's hand won't obstruct the cloth too much during the data collection. And we can put colored markers at the end of the tweezers to enable us to precisely find the pick point of the cloth. So here's kind of a video showing that process where we're lifting up the cloth and recording observations, and we can kind of track the pick point over time. So that's our data. And now in the initial step, we're going to assume the cloth starts off mostly flat, and then we can reconstruct the mesh of the cloth. And after that, we're going to use this method that I'm going to describe shortly called action condition cloth tracking to track the mesh over time. So how does that work? So essentially, we're going to assume that we have a dynamics model that can take a mesh in an action and predict the next mesh. However, there's a few things that are missing. First of all, we don't necessarily know the dynamics parameters, such as stiffness or friction. And so we're actually going to compare the mesh prediction to the observation and use a chamfer distance to over the visible parts of the mesh compared to the observation to actually optimize these dynamics parameters. And we re-optimize them actually every step, every action. So that gives pretty good predictions, but they're still not perfect. So we're also we kind of note that there's going to be this increasing gap between simulation and the real world every time an action is taken. So it might start off okay, but then kind of errors will accumulate over time. So with the next thing we're going to do is do test time optimization to correct for errors in the dynamics model. So every particle in the cloth, we're going to optimize over its position to try to correct for the errors. So again, we compare the predicted mesh to the observation, and we have two losses that we're going to use in this case, a one-way chamfer loss, and also what we call a neighborhood consistency loss, which is that neighboring nodes on the cloth should move together. The cloth shouldn't be ripping apart in this action. So we have this. So we start by calibrating the simulation parameters. Then we take the action and the initial cloth mesh and make a prediction. Then we do test time optimization, and that adjusts the particle positions in the cloth, but it might adjust them to locations that are not physically feasible. So we actually take that prediction and put it back into the dynamics model and kind of iterate between using the dynamics model to find a dynamically feasible position and doing test time optimization to find something that actually matches the observation. And here you can see the results that the cloth is now actually being tracked quite nicely and matches the real world very precisely in this case. And now we can take all of these predicted, all of these tracked cloths and use that as training data to fine-tune our mesh prediction model on this real world data. So here you can see the initial prediction of Meteor, which is our previous project, and then the updated prediction after we fine-tune the model on real world data. And you can see these predictions are much more accurate than before. We quantitatively analyze this to show that we have now lower reconstruction error and also better performance on this manipulation task. Here we specifically chose a harder manipulation test. The numbers are a little bit lower than before, but the relative performance is a significant improvement. Here we did an ablation to determine the how much different components matter. So in this case, the y-axis is the chamfer distance, so higher is lower is better. So here you can see our full model. If you don't use the dynamics model to in the tracker, then you get a drop in performance. And if you don't use test time optimization and you just use the dynamics model, then there's even a bigger drop in performance, as you can see here. And if you don't include the action at all, if you sort of just assume that you don't know what the action was between these steps and just try to optimize with test time optimization, then you get even worse performance. So kind of to wrap up this section, we propose a method for self-supervised learning for generating real-world mesh data, and we use the predicted pseudo-ground truth meshes to retrain our mesh prediction model to improve the reconstruction quality, and it improves performance in the downstream manipulation task as well. I think in order to try to get us back on the schedule, I'll kind of pause here, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave. If you have any questions, please line up on the microphone.
Hi, David. Oh, sorry. Hi, David. Thanks for the interesting talk. It seems like both of the papers you presented, you only estimate the deformation or the configuration of like a known t-shirt or a known towel in advance. Is that correct?
No, the only thing we know is that it is a t-shirt or towel. We know what type of garment it is, but we don't assume that we know the exact shape of the cloth. That's something that we optimize over.
So the underlying dimensions, the length of the sleeves are also optimized.
Yeah. So sorry, my this thing just froze. But yeah, so at the core, I guess we're building on top of garment nets, which is doing that. So I guess if we go back to this picture, so it goes from observation space to canonical space, and in this canonical space, it's kind of imagining what the full shape looks like, including the lengths of sleeves and things like that.
Oh, okay, so as long as the garment type fits into one of the canonical categories you've defined, it will work.
Well, in this case, we assume we know the category, but yes, as long as it fits in one of those categories and we know which category it is, then we can estimate the shape. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then one final question, also related, is like some shirts have collars, some can open in the middle, some have like breast pockets. Is that also captured in this canonical configuration space, or is that out of scope?
To some extent. So there's I don't know if I recall the exact different categories, but I think there's, things like jackets that have an opening in the middle. It's assuming that's kind of like not a buttoned. Oh, actually I do have that slide somewhere. Yeah. So yeah, we have a number of different garments. We don't cover every garment shape, I guess. So so I'll agree that is kind of a limitation of the method. So here you can see sort of shirt is defined as this I'm not sure why, but it's defined in this data set as kind of this shirt that has like an open, like more like a jacket. Then there's something called a jumpsuit that looks like that. So there's a few different kind of variations, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying.
Sure.
Okay, more questions? Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thanks for the great presentation. My question is about, so it seems that when you do the robot action, then you don't provide real-time feedback while performing the manipulation, so the robot action is set beforehand. So what do you think it will take to be able to modify the robot action on the fly with the visual feedback that we can get from the cloned state?
Sorry, are you talking about the first project or the second project or the?
A little bit of both. So it looks like when you perform the robot action before starting moving, you already said like the starting point.
Oh, I see. You're saying each robot action is kind of open loop, like within the pick and place motion. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Great point. Yeah. Yeah, essentially what you would really ideally want is like a hierarchical policy where you have some high level thing that tells you roughly what action to perform, like where to pick, where to place, but not the exact details. And currently we're running a motion planner to execute those details, but what you would really want is to send that information into a low-level policy that's been trained to execute these low-level actions conditioned on the high-level goal of the action. Yeah, I hope that.
How far do you think we are from there?
I'm sorry?
How far do you think we are from there?
Oh, I mean, I think that there's definitely ways to do that. I mean, I guess if I were to do it right now, you would, run DP3 or some kind of behavior cloning based policy. You just sort of need some demonstrations of people manipulating cloth, and you can use that to learn low level. Assuming people know how to do these low level actions, you can imitate them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any more questions? Okay, then let's thank the speaker again. And with this,